morning, everyone, or afternoon, or even evening. Thank you so much for joining us on our third day of PeaceCon. I'm Liz Hume. I'm the Executive Director for the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and there's so much in this session right now. I'm going to really quickly just thank everybody for participating. You're giving so graciously of your time. This is how we build the field collectively, and we are so grateful. I want to really thank the AFP team. I can't say it enough. They're phenomenal. You'll see them in the chat rooms. Please thank them. Say hello to them. I want to give a special thank you to Maurice, who is our Senior Operations and Membership Manager. She's been brilliant. And all of this is so thanks to her. I also want to give another special shout out to Nick. Nick is our policy and comms senior associate. The two of them are just incredible, and the work they've done is amazing, and I can't thank them enough. There's so many other people, but I just want to really give those two a big shout out. Please say thank you to them when you're in the chat boxes, when you're in the sessions. So I want to say this award, the Melanie Greenberg U.S. Peacebuilding Award of Excellence, has such a special place in my heart because of Melanie Greenberg. I can give you her professional bio, but I'm going to talk to you about who she is. She's brilliant. She's a true peace builder. She puts the active into active listening. I am so fortunate that she was not only my boss, my mentor, my friend, and about 10,000 other things. I always tell her she's my touchstone. Everybody should have a Melanie Greenberg in their life. Their life would be so much better for it. I can promise you that. She's just a giant in this field and a true peace builder. And I want to say how this award came about. When she told me she was leaving AFP, I first burst out into tears. And then after that, I had to think about how were we going to honor this incredible individual. One of the first conversations I had with her when I joined AFP, going back into early 2015, she'd just come off grand jury duty in Washington, D.C. And she talked about the fact that just down the street, the conflict she was seeing in areas of Washington, D.C. that many of us never even go into, and what was happening in our own country. And she and I both said, if we can't talk about what's happening in our own backyard, but we're going to go around the world and talk about conflict, it's really hypocritical. And it's at that time that AFP actually changed its mandate. At first, we were only working with organizations internationally, and we changed it to start working in the United States as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Melanie. I can't thank her enough. We came up with this idea when things in the United States we were starting to see increasing violence, instability. And I just want to turn this over to Melanie and say thank you so much, Melanie, for everything you have done for the peace building community and myself.
Liz, thank you so much. And I think it's not fair for me to present the award in tears. But I'm so grateful, Liz, for your leadership. Congratulations on your new role, for your friendship. And I want to thank AFP for all you've done to be a leader in the field of peace building during such a turbulent time in the world and here in the United States, and the work that AFP has done to bring the US peace building community together and to connect it with the international peace building community, and to move out of a role of American exceptionalism and to be accepting the wisdom from other countries that have managed deep divides. It's been truly inspiring to be a part of that. So thank you. And I can't tell you how honored I am to be here at PeaceCon. Thank you to the PeaceCon team. This has been such a rich few days. I've learned so much and felt like such a part of this community, even digitally, and that's a huge achievement. I am so honored today to give the Melanie Greenberg Award of Excellence to Patricia Schaefer and in memoriam to Jesse Morton. The two of you represent hope for me. I've noticed in the US context that there's almost a degree of fatalism to what's happening in our world in the United States. And as a professional peace builder, seeing the signs that we're moving even further into toxic polarization to the stage of dehumanization. And for those of us who work in this field, we understand that with the dehumanization comes a much higher risk of violence and a true breakage of our democracy. And so to be able to give this award to two people who for me represent pure hope is just a joy. Patricia Schaefer is the executive director of New Gen Peacebuilders, which is a peace education program emphasizing the role, value, and impact of young people ages 14 to 24 in achieving a peaceful world. Yesterday in our narrative session, we talked about frames of building and building peace. And what Patricia is doing is giving young people the skills not only to think about peace abstractly and to understand it from a political science point of view, but to see that they can build peace in their lives and their communities, to have the hands-on tools that they need. And I often think about young people now, and they must think that the adults have gone crazy. What are they thinking about the deep division they're seeing in their own schools and their own school systems, and much less in the larger United States? So Patricia, for you to give them the tools they need to build a new world, to have a new vision for their future, I'm just deeply, deeply honored that you'll be receiving this award. Thank you for all that you do. Jesse Morton, who died last month, and this was a terrible blow to all of us who knew him, he also represented hope. Jesse understood from his own experience of trauma the need for belonging. He knew that people needed narrative in their lives that could bring them into a higher cause. That trauma and the narrative led him into extremism, but it also led him out. And I'll never forget the day that he came to the Alliance for Peacebuilding and told us his story and followed the path from a childhood of deep trauma into radicalization. And then back when he was in Tunisia, talking with groups there during the Arab Spring, and recognizing that there were other ways of creating social change, peaceful ways. And even though he was jailed and had a long journey out of jail to the founding of the Parallel Networks, which is an organization that looks at more holistic mechanisms for bringing people out of extremism, he was able to draw on hope, on community, of new ways of bringing people who had been radicalized, who were extreme, who had dedicated their lives to violence, and to show them a new path forward of peace and inclusion. I spoke with Jesse about 2 weeks before he died from a very cold college campus in Ohio. And he was talking about his vision for the future of the United States and his fear. He had the voice of a prophet in the wilderness. And he was talking about how we are moving from perhaps a few hundred or 1,000 people being radicalized to most of our political polity, to most of our communities in the United States, and talked about the need for a moonshot both of understanding trauma, the way that people are divided in our societies in the United States, the way that people are feeling hopelessness and disconnection, and that their need for connection was leading them into radical extremist movements. And for him, addressing trauma, giving people ways of being together, redemption was what he was about, that he really understood that everyone can come back from a place of violence and towards a place of connection and hope. So it's just a tremendous honor to give this award to Patricia, who's with us here today, and to Jesse, who will be in our hearts forever. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And I just want to say, Melanie Greenberg is the managing director at Humanity United, a phenomenal partner foundation to the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and gave so much to have this conference happen as well. So Melanie, again, I love you. That's all I can say. And thank you for everything that you do for us and for this field. I'm going to introduce Mike Mirchuk and Mitch Silber. When I found out Jesse died, the first person I reached out to was Mike. Mike was in Jordan. He is brilliant. He works at Beyond Conflict. I can't tell you how many calls I've been on with Mike and Jesse. I call them double trouble. They make me laugh. They make me cry. Their brilliance, I would just sit and listen to them. Their brilliance, the way they would riff off each other. I just can't tell you. I'm grateful that Mike is here because Mike is part of Jesse's legacy. And I know we'll continue this work. And Mike said something so poignant to me on the call. Before we hung up, I said to him, Mike, I want you to know how brilliant I think you are and how important you are to the field. And I only wish I had another chance to say that to Jesse. Jesse and I were scheduled to have a catch up after the holidays. And Mike said to me, you know what, Liz, we need to say this to people. We should be saying these things every year to people on their birthday, the things that we would be saying at their funeral or at their memorial. So I give that to everybody as a challenge, at least on people's birthday. Tell them how grateful you are for them. So thank you, Mike. That's a gift you gave to me. Mitch, I just want to say thank you so much for being here as well. You were the co-founder of Parallel Networks. You worked really closely with Jesse. You have a long history with Jesse from your law enforcement days, and you'll talk more about that. But we are so grateful for you both being here to accept this award for Jesse. And I'm going to turn it over to you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Melanie. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for organizing this. The first time I met Jesse was at a Resolve Network event in Washington. And I knew that I was in for quite an emotional and intellectual ride because he started the first slide with an extended quote from Rumi that said, I said, what about my eyes? He said, keep them on the road. I said, what about my passion? He said, keep it burning. I said, what about my heart? He said, tell me what you hold inside it. So I said, pain and sorrow. And he said, stay with it. The wound is the place where the light enters you. And for those of you who knew Jesse's Twitter handle, Light Upon Light, Jesse was all about light. Working in peace building is inherently about working in people's wounds. To build peace is, by definition, to try to transform those structures that generate deadly and destructive conflict. It's not easy, it's not clean, it's not neat. It involves working in people's wounds. And so many of us would love to be able to do this work without getting messy, without being controversial, that we could live that aid worker life for a few years and then give it up for an armchair scholarship somewhere. So many of us want good repute and external impressions that and being loved and appreciated and applauded by everyone without actually having to go into those burdens of people who bear the brunt of conflict, division, and pain. But as you get into those spaces, you are going to become and be controversial. Because insofar as the wound is where light enters people, it's also where there's a lot of criticism and a lot of pain. To work, you know, every time I met with Jesse, we talked about the same thing, that something that he knew so viscerally and so personally, that both hatred and redemption was often birthed from deep wounds. And he knew that in his own life. And he knew that that was possible in the lives of others. And this is a man who was working across such diverse and different contexts, from Tajikistan to Macedonia to the state of New York to Virginia. And those who knew him knew that he wasn't just willing, but he was eager to sit in those dark spaces with other people. Those are spaces that need bearers of light. And to be a bearer of light in the peace building world is not easy. It has risks. And especially for those people who may themselves know that darkness. There are risks, but there's also tremendous empathy, knowledge, and insight in living from a space of your own wounds to transform the wounds of others. And in that role, there is tremendous potential for change and for transforming lives away from extremism. And I want to end just briefly before we turn to Mitch, a quote from one of the last quotes I sent to Jesse was from a Christian scholar named Henry Nouwen, someone who's very close to my heart and my intellectual formation. He says, Nobody escapes being wounded. We are all wounded people, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The main question is not how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed, but how can we put our woundedness into the service of others? When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, then we have truly become wounded healers. And it's a real honor to be able to honor Jesse and remember Jesse through this well-deserved recognition.
Thank you. Mitch? I don't know if we lost Mitch. Mitch, are you on? Mitch, you are on mute.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you, Mitch. It's okay.
Nick, thank you for those amazing words. Liz and Melanie, I want to express my appreciation to you for the kind introduction and for the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And I'm really honored today to be receiving this award on behalf of Jesse. When Jesse first told me he'd won the award, I was tremendously excited for him. Not only was I proud of his accomplishment, but I was so glad to hear that he was being recognized in a public way with such a prestigious award. I find it both ironic and comforting to be receiving this award on Jesse's behalf when it comes to a subject like peace building, where former enemies can come together. Jesse and I began our relationship as adversaries, or if I'll be more blunt, enemies. He was America's most important English language Al-Qaeda propagandist, and he was at the center of a web of terrorist plots around the world, and the hub of his network was in New York. I was the director of intelligence analysis at the NYPD, and it was my job to stop Jesse and his group, and our efforts ultimately led to his arrest. But from that arrest, Jesse went down went through a process of much deep thought and reflection while he was in prison. And he decided that he needed to change. And amazingly, he was able to effect this change within himself. But he didn't stop there. It wasn't only his own transformation that he was focused on, but he wanted to help others to find a pathway out of extremism. And that became Parallel Networks, his NGO devoted to help others find a way out of extremism and to combat polarization. So whether it was creative projects like an online magazine to challenge the Islamic State's narrative, Light Upon Light, which we talked about earlier, writing policy papers about how to care and rehabilitate former extremists in the United States, or the challenging work of working directly with extremists, whether they were former Islamists or white supremacists, to help them make that transformation from extremism. Jesse threw himself into these projects with gusto, enthusiasm, and his characteristic higher energy approach. To Jesse, winning Department of Homeland Security grants to counter violent extremism meant everything to him. He had come full circle from an enemy of the state to an ally of the state. And I think that had great significance to him. It really validated his whole trajectory. And last week, when we held a memorial for him, I can tell you, many of you were there, the diversity of the people who were on this memorial Zoom just spoke to Jesse's reach. International, former jihadist, former white supremacist, academic, nonprofit, U.S. government, counterterrorism, homeland security. It was really an amazing, diversity of people who he had touched and worked with around the world. So to close, I'm really honored to be receiving this award on behalf of my friend and my partner, Jesse Morton, who sadly we lost too soon. Jesse was all about transformation, both his own and others, and he demonstrated that change was always possible, no matter the circumstances. That's the way he lived his life. So on that note, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitch. And I think I just want to say, you really hit it in terms of reconciliation. Many people would say to me, how could you work with Jesse Morton? And I said, how could I not? We go to Srebrenica and we tell people whose neighbors were part of destroying their families to reconcile. If we can't do it here in the United States, then we have no business doing what we're doing. So thank you, Mitch. You embody that. Thank you. And I just want to say, Jesse was my friend and he was a brilliant colleague. And I think of him every day. So thank you so much. Now we're going to have a moment of 30 seconds of silence where we honor all the peace builders that have lost their lives, and also for everyone who has been touched by COVID globally, and the pandemic is still raging. So we want to take this moment. Okay, thank you all. Now we're going to switch back to our second awardee, Patricia Schaefer, another dear friend of mine, a brilliant worker in this space of new gen peace builders. The work that they have done, their work with Rotary, their work in the United States, the ability to get into schools in the United States. It's easy to go to South Sudan actually and say, we're going to work in this school in South Sudan. Well, the work isn't easy. Getting into the school and working with the schools is actually pretty easy. In the United States, there's a roadblock after roadblock of getting into schools to teach peace and to do peace. And Patricia Schaefer, this incredibly extraordinary woman, has done it, and she's doing it. And I am so honored for her to have this award, especially now as we know these issues are going down into our school boards. We see it all over, from Loudoun County to California. And this incredible woman is working with students, led by students, to bring peace and to do peace in our schools. And we are so grateful for her. Patricia.
Thank you, Liz, and hello, everyone. And I am really honored and touched to have been listening to the tributes to Jesse here today. And I really want to say that any moment in anyone's life where your little bit of effort or your lot of effort is recognized means a lot. But this award means a lot because the name of the award is the Melanie Greenberg Award for Excellence, and connected with conflict resolution and peace building in the United States. Liz called Melanie her touchstone, and I have found myself at various points over the years saying, what would Melanie do? When I'm thinking, how should I go about this? How should I solve this problem? What would Melanie do? Because to me, what Melanie embodies is the ability to both have impact and focus on results, but always put relationship front and center when she's working on really tough issues and trying to make a dent and a big difference in terms of peace building. So those are two things that anybody working in the field of peace building really has to find a way to struggle with, grapple with, and balance. How do you push? How do you move forward? How do you have results? And at the same time, keep relationship in the forefront. I want to be honest, my own journey as a peace builder, really, I like to sometimes call myself the accidental peace builder, because prior to working in this field for the past 10 years, I spent quite a bit of time in corporate settings doing change management at a scale level. But who I really am, what I finally figured out is who I really am is a social worker and educator at heart, who cares about trying to make my little bit of difference on this planet. I have said to Melanie in the past, Melanie, I think that my passion, my call in life is to try and be part of making peace building a rite of passage for everyone, which sounds, quite ambitious, maybe unrealistic, but at every turn, Melanie has said, so do it. So that's what we all need to be working on. So making peace a rite of passage, or peace education or peace building a rite of passage for everyone. The numbers, quite frankly, are daunting. There are 3 billion people on the planet who are under the age of 30. There are 1.8 billion who are between the ages of 15 and 24. And in the United States, I happen to be in Lebanon at the moment, where we're just wrapping up training for university students here. But in the United States, the numbers are incredible. 130,000 schools in the United States, 50 million students in the United States, and 15 million of them are in high school. And I happen to be particularly interested in young people between the ages of 15 and 24, though you can never start peace education too young. So these are pretty daunting numbers, especially when we also know, and Liz made this point, and the previous speakers have made this point, that the trends don't appear to be working in our favor at the moment. Downward trends, not encouraging trends in terms of peace on a global scale, but also in the United States. And so it takes for the whole community a lot of resilience and wherewithal to fight the good fight, as they say, which is a funny phrase to be using in peace building for sure. But Liz said something about when you get down to the community level, when you really get to the local level, working with people who are trying to strengthen their communities all the time, that's where you get inspired and you start to see a difference being made. And who's at the community level? Young people and teachers guiding their way. So I've had the good fortune since beginning to think I'm going to be the accidental but dedicated peace builder for about the past 8 to 10 years of working with young people and educators who want to equip young people with the skills, the understanding of the drivers of conflict and peace, but also see that if you design an effort, if you design a project quite robustly, and you know how you're trying to serve a community, you can actually make a difference. Right now, we have the good pleasure and honor of working with 300, about 600, soon to be 600 schools just in the United States and Caribbean. And here's what I've learned. Young people are eager to be invited into the peace building space. UN Resolution 2250 calls for us to offer the full inclusion to young people in youth, peace, and security around the world. And of course, there's tremendous energy for that in the United States too. But who we cannot forget in the whole process is educators, teachers. And I have come to see over the time that I've been working in this space that the untapped opportunity is for us all to be honoring educators, honoring teachers, and helping them do their best to work with young people to guide them as young peace builders. So just as it's an honor for me to receive this award, I want to say it's an honor to work with all of you in conflict resolution and peace building, to work with these educators and to work with young people and see that they see what the future and potential is for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And I tell this story. I met Patricia, I think maybe in 2016. She sent me a Christmas card and put a link of her work. And I went on it and I looked at it. And I picked up the phone and called her, and because I said, this is a woman I want to know, and I want to know the work she's doing, and I want to know how AFP can support her. And I can't thank you enough, Patricia, for everything that you're doing especially in US schools. So needed now. So thank you. So now we're going to do a quick video of our incredible social activation yesterday, or our media social activation. Can we cue the video? I want to say that yesterday alone on this hashtag, we had over 600,000. I don't know what it's called. When you see, I'm not a kid. I'm not on social media that much. People use the hashtag. With our hashtag Rise to Build Peace for PeaceCon, we've had over 1 million interactions, something. So keep it up today. We're getting big numbers. So cue the video.
Walking through the shadows, out here in the night. Just need some hope for tomorrow. We will be fine. In the middle of the valley, when you're looking time. I got you through and through. Cover me, I'll cover you. I'm staying by your side. We are together, together in this. Together is strong and never alone. My brother, my sister, don't give up on hope. It's gonna get better. 'Cause we are together. We are together. Together in this. Only in the darkness can we really see the stars. You know you don't need a rocket. We can travel by heart. If you're ever feeling lonely, just close your eyes, and within a second you'll find me right by your side. We are together, together in this. Together is strong and never alone. My brother, my sister, don't give up on hope. It's gonna get better. 'Cause we are together. We are together. Together in this. We are together. Together in this. We are together. Together in this. Together we're strong and never alone. We are together, together in this. Together we're strong, never alone. My brother, my sister, don't give up on hope. It's gonna get better. 'Cause we are together. You're my brother, my sister, and this is our home. It's gonna get better. 'Cause we are together. We are together. Together in this.
So we did that yesterday. That's amazing. And I want everybody to keep it up with that hashtag, We Build Peace. And also Rise to Build Peace. Those hashtags are trending on Twitter. And it shows when we come together collectively, we can do something big. It also brings in what Julia Roig, our board chair and the founder of the Horizons Project, said yesterday, the Frameworks Research, Assistant Administrator Rob Jenkins from USAID. They all say we have to tell our story better. We have to tell our story better. So that's my challenge to you all. Keep telling the story better in an active way and not just about the problems. So now this panel is phenomenal. And I want to start off by introducing Stephen Hines, the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. I'm so grateful. I got to know him through one of our board members, the amazing Rick Barton. This is like the third shout out to Rick Barton over this conference. Rick Barton is the connector of all, Ambassador Rick Barton. So I want to thank him. But I want to say, Stephen has been working on issues on the US before people even knew there were issues in the US, going back into the 90s, for example. He co-founded and was the president of a public policy organization that was looking at economic inequality and how to bring citizen engagement. He has had a long career in public service. He, in 2018, was named one of 3 co-chairs by the Academy of Arts and Sciences to put together a national commission on how do we work on peace building, democracy in the United States. He helped work on the Common Purpose Report that I encourage, if you have not read it, read it. It's the roadmap of how we work on rebuilding our democracy, renewing our democracy, building peace, and equality. And I just want to turn it over to you, Stephen, and say how grateful we are. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Liz, for that very generous introduction. I'm really honored to be asked to offer some opening remarks on the theme of this morning at PeaceCon, renewing and rebuilding America's disrupted democracy. I'm especially actually looking forward to the panel of experts who are going to address this theme after I speak, and certainly they will do it with greater insight and precision that I can. And let me just say that I'm grateful for the mercy of speaking before them rather than after. I also want to congratulate the Melanie Greenberg Award winners. What amazing stories and inspiring leaders, and congratulations to all of you. So, in an alternate universe, January 6, 2021 might have marked an inflection point in our decades-long story of democratic decline. Instead, in the years since the violent insurrection on the Capitol, our democracy has moved closer to the brink of irreversible harm. I'm profoundly sobered by the data published earlier this month by Robert Pape, one of our panelists. The University of Chicago's Project on Security and Threats reports that 21 million Americans, 8% of the population, believe that the use of force is justified to restore President Trump to the White House. The insurrectionist movement in the United States threatens to grow and raises the specter of violence over the 2022 midterms and beyond. Other panelists will share more about the extraordinary work they and their institutions are doing to understand and address our democracy crisis. And I'll limit myself to sharing just a few additional data points that most of us already know, but it's important that we keep them in mind. First, the US has declined steadily in the Freedom House reports over the past decade, now ranking alongside Romania, Croatia, and Panama, countries that our own democracy promotion organizations have worked in. Only a quarter of Americans say they can trust the government in Washington. Nearly half are unable to name the three branches of government. And more than 1,800 local newsrooms have closed since 2004, creating a crisis of access to local news and information. So how did we get here? And where do we go next? It's easy to point a finger at failing institutions and divisive political leaders, and they certainly shoulder much of the blame. But my thesis, however, is that our political culture, our civic culture, is of equal significance in both diagnosing the problem and finding a path to a solution. I come to this thesis about democracy and political culture through a nearly 50-year career in which a focus on democracy has been the consistent through line. In 1990, after 15 years in Connecticut politics and state government, and inspired by the fall of the Berlin Wall, I moved to Prague. I spent the next decade working with an international NGO to help strengthen the nascent democracies of Eastern Europe. And the story of democracy's rise and decline in that region provides a cautionary tale for us. In a remarkable and remarkably brief period of time, the authoritarian governments of the Soviet Empire were overthrown as citizens took peacefully to the streets in Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, and ultimately Moscow. In our euphoria over these rapid and unexpected transformations, we began to believe that just possibly the most difficult part of the global struggle for freedom and democracy was over. But our mistake was to assume that Eastern Europe's new democratic institutions would be sufficient to enable democracy to take root, grow, and thrive. 3 decades later, an elected prime minister now rules by decree in Hungary. Sustained attacks have undermined the independence of the judicial system in Poland. State capture and abuse of power are facts of life in Serbia and Montenegro. Warsaw, Budapest, and Belgrade do not lack democratic institutions, at least nominally. But without a robust democratic civic culture as the foundation, institutions crumble. The story of democracy in Eastern Europe teaches us that it is far easier, actually, to create the processes and institutions of democracy than it is to nurture and sustain a healthy democratic political culture. Now, I certainly don't propose a one-to-one correspondence between the backsliding of Eastern Europe's democracies and the vastly different democratic challenges faced by the United States as we look toward our 250th anniversary. The American social, political, and historical context is unique. But there is a common denominator, and that is the foundational importance of political culture. Alexis de Tocqueville used the term habits of the heart. These are the norms, beliefs, habits, and rituals that inform how we relate to one another and to our shared system of self-government. John Dewey spoke of civic faith. When our habits of the heart are weak, when our civic faith falters, our formal institutions and processes falter too. Apathy and a lack of trust lead to declining participation in the institutions and processes of self-government, which further cause those institutions themselves to become less representative and less effective, and thereby less worthy of our trust and engagement. The downward spiral continues. But we can reverse this spiral. Building representative and responsive institutions will inspire citizens to participate and kindle a culture of commitment to our democracy and one another. And strengthening our political culture will breathe life into our institutions and create the dynamic energy necessary to repair, reimagine, and reinvent them. This upward spiral that I've just described, the virtuous cycle of institutions and political culture, forms the conceptual DNA of the project that Liz mentioned, that I've had the privilege to co-chair at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The Academy's Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship was convened in 2018. We deliberated for 2 years and traveled the country listening to Americans in their communities to develop a set of recommendations aimed at reinventing American democracy for the challenges of the 21st century. The Commission's final report, Our Common Purpose, proposes 31 recommendations across the domains of institutions, civil society, and civic culture. We concluded that reforms to voting and key institutions of our government are both essential and insufficient to create the inclusive, effective, and resilient democracy we need to manage the challenges of the 21st century. Efforts to inspire a new civic culture are the essential complement. Among the most transformative of the Commission's recommendations, I believe, are those that focus directly on our culture, including a massive increase in investment in civic education, establishing a universal expectation of a year of national service by young Americans, and dramatically expanding paid service opportunities, creating a trust for civic infrastructure that would provide financial and technical support to citizens working together in their communities in ways that contribute to the common good, not unlike the National Endowment for Democracy, which can only work abroad. In December, President Biden hosted the International Democracy Summit, in which he proposed a year of action to renew democracy around the world. I draw attention to the recommendations of Our Common Purpose as a way of suggesting important actions that the United States democracy community might take in the coming year. Election integrity is clearly an urgent priority. Nearly a dozen states, including key battleground states, have already passed legislation that undermines the voting process at critical stages, from the freedom of voters to cast their ballot to the power of nonpartisan election officials to count and certify the results. I'm grateful to the Partnership for American Democracy and to Ashley Korku on our panel for important efforts they are developing around election integrity and combating misinformation. There is much to do over the coming year and no time to lose. But as we mobilize to address the most urgent challenges we face, let's also keep the longer time horizon in view. To repair and reimagine our civic culture is a long-term and fundamental project of our age. The Year of Action is just the beginning of a generation of renewal. I'll conclude these remarks with a brief historical perspective. In December 1862, with the nation brutally divided by civil war, Abraham Lincoln called on Americans to see the nature of the challenges they faced, to think differently, and to act collectively. In an address to Congress, Lincoln said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." We must disenthrall ourselves. Lincoln's remarkable phrase seems so appropriate for our own times. We need to shake loose from conventional wisdom, the politics of division and business as usual. Our country can be different. We can find purpose in this century. Our character as a people and our success as a nation depends on it. Thank you for having me with you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And that's exactly what we needed. I think this morning, it's not only talking about what's wrong, but the hope and how do we move forward. And that's really what this session is about. I'm going to turn it over now to my wonderful colleague, Theo. Theo is a senior fellow at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. He works on U.S. peacebuilding and on policy and advocacy. And he is the brilliance behind so much of our successes in this work. And I can't thank you enough, Theo. Theo, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Liz and Stephen. You have really laid out a solid foundation, I think, for the rest of our time together this morning and for our discussion. Now we're going to transition into really kind of a deeper discussion with a kind of a superstar lineup of speakers. My own objective for this morning is for us, hopefully, to gain a clearer understanding and a clearer picture of the potential for political violence here in the US, and particularly lessons learned in the post-January 6th context, and how extremist movements are changing and morphing, and particularly what the implications are for democracy and governance here in the United States. We'd like to highlight some cutting-edge research on the intersections between polarization, democratic decline, and neuroscience, and we have an expert on the panel who's going to talk about that. Draw out, and then getting to the solution, as Liz mentioned. Draw out what effective programming should look like, and particularly, the Alliance for Peacebuilding has been working internationally for so long through its membership. Are there lessons that we can bring from our international practice to practice here in the United States? And then finally, discuss the necessary policy responses at all levels of our democracy, of our government, both national, state, and local levels. And what would that perhaps look like? I feel like Stephen has unpacked that a little bit already, and my hope is that we can go a little bit deeper into that. So with that, I would like to turn to Professor Robert Pape. Professor Robert Pape is from the University of Chicago and is the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, or CPOST. And they have done just some incredible research into the makeup of the actors behind political violence in the US, with a particular focus on the January 6th violence at the US Capitol just last year. So Professor Pape, if I may turn to you now, maybe perhaps you can start by talking about the factors that are driving political violence in the US. Are there any surprising data that you learned through your research? And then perhaps more importantly, what are some responses from your purview? So Professor Pape, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Theo. Stephen is exactly right that this is a precarious moment for America. Our democracy is being tested like never before in our lifetimes. There's a core reason for that comes out of our research, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. The core reason is that extremism in our country is moving from the fringe to the mainstream. This is a new phenomenon. We're not used to thinking of extremism as part of the mainstream. We're used to thinking of extremism as relating to beliefs held by less than 1% of the population, by people on the margins of society, by the edges of the fringe of social media. Well, none of that really represents the extremism confronting our democracy today. We have a new empirical reality, and it's crucial to focus on the core element of our political culture that's been missing, and that's dialogue. Dialogue, not monologue shouting at each other, is the crucial element that's been missing in our political culture. And I thank PeaceCon for helping the dialogue. This is crucial, and I believe this is what we need going forward. Now, let me unpack the research just a bit. So anybody listening here can go to our CPOST website, and they will see PowerPoint presentations, reports detailing the research. We've done multiple studies, and I just want to give you a little bit of information about those studies. First study we've done is deep and comprehensive analysis of the demographics and home county characteristics of who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. There have been over 700 charged with storming the Capitol as of January 1st. And CPOST, with large research teams, have been able to understand the demographics and their home county characteristics in some depth. One of the most striking things is their economic profile. Over half of the 700 are business owners, CEOs, and from white-collar occupations, doctors, lawyers, architects, accountants, managers. This is extremely different than we're used to thinking. Only 7% were unemployed at the time they stormed into the Capitol. Some stayed at the Willard, one of the posh hotels in Washington, D.C. This is extremely different than we're used to seeing with extremists, where extremists in the United States have been arrested by the FBI, violent offenders, right-wing violent offenders, typically are 25% unemployed, maybe even more. Further, when we look at militia affiliation, only about 13% are affiliated with militia groups like the Oath Keepers or extremist groups like the Proud Boys. That means nearly 90% are not. What made the storm a storm on January 6th was not the militia groups, it was the non-militia participants in the storm. That's what overwhelmed Capitol Police. Well, this too is extremely different than we're used to seeing when we look at right-wing violent offenders arrested in the United States over the last 10 years, where half are members of skinhead gangs, prison gangs, militia groups. This is just a very, very different profile than we're used to seeing. Further, we look at their home county characteristics. Where do they live? Where did they come from? They came from nearly every state in the Union, many from the bluest states in the Union, New York and California. The couple of states that actually didn't have insurrectionists are some of the reddest states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming. Extremely striking to see 45 states participate in this. And what's also striking is when we look at their counties, over half are from counties that Biden won. That is, the more the county voted for Trump, the less likely it was to have an insurrectionist. The more rural the county, the less likely to have an insurrectionist. They're coming from San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, Dallas, Houston, many of the core metropolitan areas that Democrats win comfortably. This is extremely striking. What is the most important characteristic of those counties? The most important characteristic is that these are the counties that have lost the most white, non-Hispanic white population in the last 10 years. And you might ask yourself, well, why would it be that someone living in a county losing white population, and by the way, the insurrectionists are overwhelmingly white, here 94%, why would that be? Well, just have to remember that mainstream politicians, mainstream popular media figures have been touting the right-wing conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement now for a long period of time. So we should not be surprised that if mainstream politicians, mainstream media figures are scaring people about demographic change, that then people living, mainstream folks living in areas of demographic change might become angry enough to get involved with storming the Capitol. And so we now, learning that, we went further. Because once we knew this was more of a mainstream phenomenon, we surveyed the sentiments of the general population in multiple nationally representative surveys, the gold standard of surveys, random draws on a nationally representative panel. And what we discovered in multiple surveys, that is extending the summer over through the fall, is that the equivalent of 21 million Americans hold two extreme beliefs. One, that Joe Biden stole, not doubts, but stole the 2020 election and is an illegitimate president. And two, that the use of force to restore Donald Trump to the presidency is justified. That's striking. And if you look at the distribution, you would see more strongly agree than somewhat agree with those extreme beliefs. This is extremely concerning. This means that 8% at least, we have a margin of error of 2.9%, so could be as much as 11% of American adults hold these extreme beliefs. Well, this is much larger than 1% or less that we usually think of with the fringe extremist movements. And they are spread across the United States. So this is not, and they're coming from urban areas in the United States. They're coming overwhelmingly from metropolitan areas, similar to the insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol. And the fact is, this data is showing that this movement is stable. It's showing that 2 million of those 21 million excuse me, attended protests in the last 12 months, pardon me. Sorry about that. Given a few of these talks. So this is extremely concerning as we go forward because we're moving into a volatile 2022 election season, to say nothing of 2024. What we're seeing is combustible material. Think of it as dry brushwood during wildfire season that could be touched off by a political lightning strike or a political spark. In social science, we can't predict lightning strikes. What we can do is measure and assess the scope and drivers of the combustible material, those community sentiments. And the fact that it's 21 million and so stable is extremely concerning as we go forward. We have to be concerned about replays of stolen election violence. in key states like Georgia and elsewhere, and also the consequences of what will happen politically in Washington if the House and the Senate, one or both, flip, and what that will mean in terms of whether the new Congress will move to decertify the 2020 election for Joe Biden and recertify it for Donald Trump. These are extremely concerning scenarios now as we go forward. So I can also say a word about social media. Social media is an issue here, but overwhelmingly the 21 million is getting its media consumption from mainstream conservative media, Fox, Newsmax, and One America. There's more information about that on our website. So what you are seeing is at every step, this is a mainstream phenomenon. What we need now is dialogue. We need diagnosis going forward, for sure. We need to continue this research going forward. CPOST is going to be expanding into a third range where we're doing structured focus groups, because listening and dialogue is crucial, and you'll be hearing more about that in the next few months. But as we go forward, it's very important that we really have research, use our tools to understand and diagnose our situation today. This is one of the great strengths of our democracy. It's part and parcel of what it means to have deliberation and dialogue. We need to have dialogue and deliberation over our new empirical reality, which is that extremism is now in the mainstream. This is a challenge for our politicians and political leaders, challenge for law enforcement, challenge for communities, and challenge for the main informed public. But it is a challenge that we can step up to and strengthen our political culture. Thank you.
Professor Pape, thank you so much for that underpinning and for that data. I mean, CPOST has done some incredible work. Certainly when Liz and I saw the data and the research coming out, it really blew us away. So I'm glad that you were able to join us today and for that analysis. So I wanted to turn to Michelle Barsa, and Michelle Barsa is the Program Director for Democracy and Social Identity at Beyond Conflict. Beyond Conflict works at the intersection of peacebuilding and neuroscience. And Michelle recently wrote a paper pulling that out, focusing on authoritarianism. So Michelle, I'm wondering, as you go into your presentation, talking a little bit about the connections between deepening polarization and the psychological factors that are driving divisions here in the US. So I'm looking forward to hearing more and digging into that. So Michelle, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thanks, Theo. Like you mentioned, what I want to do today is take a step back and talk about the politics of fear and the psychological underpinnings of democracy, to talk about the ways in which fear is manipulated and how it relates this particular brand of right-wing populist sentiment that we see on the rise, not just in the US, but globally. And alongside that, I'd like to have a conversation about social identity and its relationship to the US's deviation away from democratic norms. But let's start with fear. I think probably the most fundamental point is that the human brain itself is not partisan. It pursues the singular apolitical aim of trying to keep you alive. To do that, it scans for threat and danger at all times, it codifies memories of fear, and it guides behaviors it thinks will keep you safe from harm. And it doesn't necessarily search for truth in that process. As another way to keep you safe, your mind seeks belonging in groups and collectives, driving your desire to join groups of others that are like you, which academics call in-groups, to help defend against potential threats from groups to which you do not belong, which academics call out-groups. Because personal identity is tied to group identity, keeping your core group safe is equated with keeping you safe. So throughout this process, our brains don't necessarily distinguish between material threats to our physical safety and threats to our identity. And identity threats here can relate to whether our groups are seen as moral or good, They can relate to a potential loss of power and influence, or whether our groups are allowed to freely express their culture, abide by their preferred values, etc. And we have this natural impulse to defend the status and power of our group. Important to remember here also is that our perceptions of this threat are more likely to activate fear than any actual or objectively assessed measure of that threat. So the main point being that threat and the fear it elicits are fundamental psychological processes that govern how we think and behave. That part is human. The manipulation of fear to achieve power, that part is political. So what does it look like in the US? Our country is changing rapidly and in many different ways. There are, as Dr. Pape mentioned, demographic changes that predict a white minority in about 2 or 3 decades. There's a successful mass mobilization of social justice movements that is inviting this national conversation and reckoning on race, forcing us to confront a painful past and present. There are unprecedented levels of inequality, and now, of course, a pandemic that both highlights our interdependence and provides fodder for our divisions. These factors contribute to a documented rise in the extent to which majority populations, white populations in this country feel threatened, that how they perceive threats to their identity. And it's a particular type of social identity threat called social status threat, or a fear over losing structural power, as well as losing a particular way of life and social prestige. Generally speaking, it's a fear of being left behind. This perception of threat is readily exploited and manufactured by politicians and the media. So think, for example, about replacement theory, like Dr. Pape mentioned, this narrative that white people are being steadily replaced by immigrants and people of color. There was a representative study recently where 42% of white respondents perceived that their groups, that other groups, outgroups, wanted to restrict white Americans' ability to express themselves and their culture. So this is combined with the other research we have that shows that individuals who believe that minority group members have too much power are more likely to want to take the law into their own hands, to view political violence as legitimate, and to mistrust election results. When you feel threatened, you're more likely to see threat in the information you consume, even if it's not objectively there. You're also then looking for leaders who will defend your group. So Ivan Marovich actually said in one of yesterday's panels that in this stage, truth dies because it doesn't matter. And he's right, because in this state of heightened threat, it's about survival, not reason. So how does this tie back to democratic norms and democratic legitimacy in this country? There is a difference between whether a person or group highly values democratic norms and whether or not they're willing to violate those norms. So those two things are tied to different psychological processes. How much we value democratic norms and embrace political tolerance relates to how much we as individuals and groups internalize abstract democratic principles and fuse those principles with our sense of identity. Conversely, whether we're willing to violate those norms when it comes to certain groups, that part is determined by threat, particularly by identity threat. So you might consider a progressive community, for example, that highly values norms relating to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, but will still organize to prevent, say, the Proud Boys or another right-wing group from staging a demonstration in their town because it's an affront to their values, their moral code, and their way of life. There's a dominant narrative now in this country that Americans no longer value democratic norms. But what's interesting is that we have run 2 nationally representative surveys measuring how important Democrats and Republicans believe certain democratic norms to be. And what we found is that on a scale of 0 to 100, Democrats and Republicans consistently rate these norms as being highly important, on average at about 90 on the scale. There's only, in actuality, a 3-point difference between where the parties stand on this. Then we asked members of various parties, of Democrats or Republicans, how much they perceive members of the other party to hold those norms as important. When we asked them how important they thought members of the other party hold those democratic norms, those scores dropped dramatically. Overall, there was then a 70-point difference in perceived positions. Okay, so 3-point actual difference, 70-point difference in perceptions. And the larger the perception gap was for an individual, the more likely that person was to be willing to violate democratic principles to help their own group. So if you think about democracy as an ongoing exercise in collective decision-making and cooperation, for it to work, you have to trust that the other side plays by the rules, and we don't. This absence of trust is reflected in the astronomically high levels of polarization right now. And here I'm focusing on polarization that is identity-based, where it becomes about the person, not the policy. The research shows a strong correlation between high levels of identity-based polarization and democratic degradation at the state level. But the research we have so far doesn't necessarily show a connection between polarization and democratic attitudes, meaning that even if we do reduce affective polarization or identity-based polarization, it's not clear that it would improve the willingness of people to uphold democratic norms. Recent studies find that depolarization interventions do not reliably translate into reduced support for undemocratic practices, undemocratic candidates, or partisan violence, which may suggest that affective polarization is not an effective proxy for anti-democratic attitudes. But that's not to say that the depolarization work doesn't have importance, because it does. It's just to say that it may have a different purpose than what practitioners may contend. And perhaps I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I mean, the research and the analysis that Beyond Conflict does in this area, I'm learning something new every time I read a document that comes out of Beyond Conflict, and it just kind of blows my mind. So thank you for that. And I'd love to come back in the Q&A to kind of unpack that a little bit more. So yeah, would love, so please do stay on. Would like to transition to Gerald Holt. Jared, I'm so glad that you could join us. Jared is the resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. The DFR lab has done some groundbreaking work in analyzing the digital space and how violent extremist groups are changing their tactics. So Jared, please unpack that for us. What's changing? How is the movement shifting? And again, importantly, how should we as peace builders respond? And what could that response perhaps look like?
Sure. And first off, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to address this conference, and especially on this topic, because I think that extremism domestically, and as Dr. Pape put forward with his research, this sort of large-scale radicalization is one of the biggest challenges facing the U.S. today. And unfortunately, we're up against a lot. There's some elected officials and very powerful voices in our political discourse that are trying to expedite these processes, but I don't think all is lost. So as far as the way that domestic extremist movements are changing, a lot of it has to do, at least in the last year, with decentralization. And the reasons for these can vary and change, but ultimately, extremism, anti-democratic attitudes, they are a fluid. And, these forces in society existed before January 6th, they continue to exist today, and they always change to match whatever container or set of circumstances exist for them in society. So the goal is not to eradicate them entirely. As nice as that would be, it is impossible, but instead to confine that container to the fringes of society where it does belong, and then to address policy and social movements in a way that enables us to combat the most violent offshoots of those movements. So when I talk about decentralization, it's been alluded to already that a lot of the energy that we saw expressed on January 6th has kind of crawled into a lot of people's backyards across the country. Even though January 6th and the Capitol attack was unsuccessful in its broader goal of reversing the election results, A lot of those beliefs are still deeply held by the crowds and forces that animated the attack, and they're being expressed in a way that looks like local activism. It's going into these communities, engaging with government on the state, regional, sometimes local, or even hyper-local level, and seeking to transform those institutions in ways that may make the next time an election comes around and they don't like the results, go a bit more favorably for them, or be potentially more successful for their movements. So throughout the years, a lot of conversations about national security and disinformation looked outward, and I think that at least collectively, at least painting with the broadest brushstroke imaginable, some of us missed what was happening in our backyards. That is changing for the better, and we have a lot of brilliant voices, many of which I'm on this panel with today, pushing that ball forward. But we still have great lengths to go in promoting political engagement that, rather than corrosive, is productive. It's about rebuilding trust. It's about addressing social disorder that these movements are seeking to exploit as they build and propagandize. And this expression in these smaller local venues targeting, not always these, vaguer national causes, but these very specific local ones, targeting local institutions and members of smaller communities like healthcare workers. It means that it's just more crucial than ever to disseminate knowledge about these threats down to the local level and build up a collective understanding, because you can't push back on what you don't know. And unfortunately, what we've seen is a lot of these smaller venues and smaller government entities and spaces don't have the kind of resources that exist on the national level to meaningfully address and push back. So I think that's a big part of it. Also, another huge part of it is addressing the presence of these movements within law enforcement. Law enforcement is going to have to be part of the solution here. And if, as we've seen through reporting and some of the arrests that happened in the wake of January 6th, some of these movements, groups like the Oath Keepers, cater explicitly to law enforcement and seek to build partnerships with them that enable them to both further their perception of credibility and also act with a certain degree of impunity on these smaller local levels. So addressing that and getting that out of law enforcement is going to be a crucial step in rebuilding trust and also in addressing the problem more directly. So, in addition to that, there are also roles for tech companies to play, policymakers to play, and for national leadership to step forward and define a clear moral vision. But there's also things that the rest of us can do. And I think one of the best things we can do is engage with the democratic system to the fullest of our capacities. These movements are running candidates in these local elections. They're trying to place their people into state election boards. And they're engaging with the democratic process, albeit for anti-democratic goals, not to fulfill the roles that they're seeking, but to obtain them and then use their position to disintegrate the fabric of that process. So at least for the time being, there are more of us than there are of them. And I'd like to keep it that way. So I think, the best thing we can do right now is act like it.
Jared, thank you so much, and for that analysis. Again, I mean, it's incredible as we learn more. It seems like there's just more layers that we need to keep peeling. So transitioning to Stacia. Stacia George is the director for the Conflict Resolution Program at the Carter Center. As many of us know, I mean, of course, the Carter Center is renowned for their work globally. I think about a year or so ago, when I learned that the Carter Center was doing work here in the United States, I was surprised and excited and happy, and that the center is doing work at the community level here in the U.S. In terms of mitigating political violence, promoting human rights and racial justice, and women's participation and access to information. So Stacia, I'm so glad that you're here. Wondering if you can share a little bit about the lessons that the center has learned from its work internationally, and how you are applying those lessons here in the U.S. and what that looks like for promoting democracy here in our own country. Take it away, Stacia. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. And yes, I think we are equally surprised to be doing work in the U.S. as well, but it's critical, as everyone has laid the framework for seeing why that is here today. President Carter had similar reflections as those of others who are on this panel. On January 6th, he noted, "Our great nation now teeters on the brink of a widening abyss, and without immediate action, we are at genuine risk of civil conflict and losing our precious democracy." And this is an unprecedented statement coming from a former president, one that sounds the alarm for American democracy in no uncertain terms. From our experience working abroad, the Carter Center is extremely concerned that there is a serious threat to U.S. peace and democracy caused by the rise of dehumanizing, zero-sum, identity-based politics in a heavily armed population. And these challenges are fed by the weaknesses in our electoral and democratic systems, the changed norms that now accept violence and attacks on our democratic systems, declining trust in our political system, disinformation, profound grievances across the board, and systems that perpetuate inequalities in our society. And for example, 8 of the last 20 years of the US presidency were led by a president that did not win the popular vote. 147 House Republicans voted not to certify the elections. As we hurtle towards the midterm and the next presidential elections, the situation is becoming even more dire. And as noted, significant percentages of Americans are willing to resort to violence to save our country, and those numbers are not going down. We see weakening democracy and the rise of fragility in the US as not just a threat to the US, but to the world, given the US's leadership on these issues. We fear the US may become too occupied with its own issues or lose the credibility required to advance peace and democracy globally as well. These dangerous and complex trends require a whole of society and whole of government intervention. And there is an urgent need to prioritize and fund measures that support dialogue and conflict prevention and strengthen our democratic processes at all levels. So the Carter Center has launched a new stream of work designed to help strengthen democracy and stability in the United States, because we recognize how democracy and peace can be so intertwined. And democratic processes are critical for all of society to be able to raise and address grievances, which, if not addressed, can fuel conflict. We are bringing to bear the center's expertise in conflict resolution, democracy, elections, and human rights to address this complex interlocking set of challenges. And this includes by building diverse networks for dialogue, conflict response and resolution, and promoting democratic norms and norms of nonviolence, protecting key democratic processes around elections, addressing disinformation, and addressing racial injustice. So let me start with our work on preventing identity-based violence and political violence mitigation. Per Dr. Pape's emphasis on dialogue as a key solution, we're mobilizing diverse cross-partisan coalitions of local influencers in key states to dialogue and also advocate for common democratic norms and norms of nonviolence. What we are encouraged by as we build these networks, as Michelle pointed out, is that there is a common concerns and desire around many of these norms and democratic principles, much more than we see in mainstream media, one would say. And these coalitions that we're working to build, we are preparing with the tools for resolving conflicts around these issues, as well as rapid response and early warning. So for now, we are prioritizing potential conflict around elections, but we're preparing these coalitions with the tools to address any type of conflict that may arise at local, county, state, or national levels. And the idea is grounded in social science, that by connecting the right messengers and influencing them, and influencers, and equipping them with pro-democracy, anti-violence tools to discuss these issues constructively in a non-polarizing way, we can increase commitment to democratic processes and reduce the likelihood of violence. And these networks are also being built to prevent and respond to conflicts as they arise. Each state and locality has the flexibility to craft their own locally specific programming and messaging. And using analysis of risk factors, we identified our first target states through November 2022 midterm cycle to be Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and parts of Florida. And we hope to expand to additional high-risk states in the run-up to the 2024 election cycle. Some of our work with these groups includes doing proactive emergency response planning to ensure that key local leaders are in contact with one another, have messages and other responses prepared in the event of disruptions to the electoral process or acts of violence. And another goal of these coalitions is to mobilize constructive pressure on candidates for office that would push them to sign local electoral codes of conduct. These voluntary agreements candidates sign to commit to minimum standards of behavior, such as accepting the outcome of an election. And in addition to the codes of conduct, we're working to address the crisis of confidence in our elections by developing and deploying networks of nonpartisan citizen election observers, similar to what we do overseas, supporting election officials, including through mental health resources, rolling out a voter education campaign in Georgia regarding changes in voting procedures following the passage of Senate Bill 202, conducting events with the Baker Institute for Public Policy on rational, data-driven, bipartisan discussion of electoral reform, and addressing disinformation in the infodemic. As noted previously, disinformation is a driving wedge in our society, amplifying tensions and reducing the effectiveness of information campaigns, which are a staple in peace building. The US government must prioritize addressing this issue, and we're addressing it by conducting in-depth social media analysis and making data-driven recommendations to social media platforms. We recently published our The Big Lie in Big Tech report available on our website on how media sources known to repeatedly spread misinformation coordinated themselves to amplify the big lie. And we provide concrete recommendations that platforms can take to mitigate the spread of false information. We're also developing media literacy programming, particularly for adults where there's a large gap. Lastly, the center has launched racial justice-focused programming to address the systemic inequalities that continue to undermine the very meaning of democracy for many Americans. In partnership with the King Center and the consulting firm Freedom Road, we are advancing truth-telling efforts through private and public convenings and a robust communication strategy. And this will include working with evangelical churches to facilitate truth-telling within their congregations. We are also developing a truth-telling program specific to the center's home state of Georgia, applying a human rights framework to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow that will result in recommendations for policymakers on ways to address historic injustices and advance human rights for all. What we do know is this work is not easy, and there's much to be learned, and there's much to be done in the coming months, which will only, unfortunately, become more perilous as we get closer to the midterm elections. We invite anyone who would like to partner with us in these efforts to reach out to us, because we must all work together so we can avoid falling into the abyss that President Carter warned us of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacia. Doing work at the community, state level to mitigate violence. I think that's crucially important. I'd like to zoom out a bit now and turn to Ashley Kwarku. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us. Ashley is the Senior Director for the Democracy Pillar and Programs at the Partnership for American Democracy, a new national level initiative that was just launched last summer with bipartisan leaders coming on board to support the initiative. Ashley, tell us a little bit about PFAD's work to advance American democracy. And my hope is that you can really kind of unpack for us the needed policy responses, particularly, as Stephen mentioned, in the kind of the post-democracy summit year of action. What do the policy responses look like from where you sit? Thank you.
Sure.
Ashley.
Well, thank you so much, Theo. Thanks to AFP for the invitation, and it's been just a privilege to hear from all the great research from my co-panelists that I'm consume rapidly myself. So, just quickly, I come from this international a career as a global democracy practitioner. And one of the core parts of that work over the course of my career was always about defining a vision for change and a strategy for making that change that would drive diplomatic efforts, that would drive foreign assistance investments over, say, a 5-year interval. And I think really what we are aspiring to now at the Partnership for American Democracy is an articulation of that kind of vision, that for a vibrant, inclusive, constitutional democracy, but one that can put in place the legal safeguards, the policies, and the investments in the sectors and institutions that are ultimately going to fuel that vision. And that means we need a multi-stakeholder approach. We need government, we need civil society, we need private sector, we need the faith community and faith leaders at the table. And so we are working with nearly 100 partners across the democracy landscape and also within our allied communities, again, faith, higher education, and business. These groups and leaders that we are working with represent a broad diversity of ideological perspective. And as you said, as many people have said, we really need to bring in a sort of bipartisan approach to dialogue and engagement around this common vision of what we want our democracy to be. And we're mobilizing around 5 goals that we think are necessary for democratic renewal in America and guided by the urgency of making meaningful progress on those goals in advance of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which will fall on January 4th, 2026, so not that far away. And this, of course, is built on the amazing work of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Art Common Purpose Report, and I think that's really been a seminal kind of inspiration for an agenda that it has emerged and that is now being mobilized around. And so very quickly, just to tick off these 5 broad goals, first, we need universal civic learning, and that means not just for children, but also for adults, because as we've heard from our researchers, a lot of the challenge and vulnerability to anti-democratic attitudes and norms lies with adults. And so we need opportunities for our learners of all ages to learn the sort of civic skills, dispositions, and behaviors that will enable them to be stewards of our deliberative political culture and our sense of mutual obligation to one another. Second, we need expanded civic engagement, yes, through activism, but also through service and volunteering, because these are the ways in which people gain an understanding of the humanity of other people, but they also gain a sense of personal agency that they can, in fact, in their own local communities, make a difference and have a change. Many people have talked about what I'll mention next, which is the need for deepened social cohesion, belonging, and respect for difference. We are a highly diverse nation across multiple kinds of multiple areas, our religious pluralism, our ethnic and racial pluralism, our ideological diversity, of course. And we really have to increase our familiarity, our ability to relate respectfully to people across difference. And this is really, as we all know, the foundation on which democratic competition rests. Without that foundation, we really can't have a democracy. So this is a critical area, and I think one where we've really seen wonderful collaboration with the peacebuilding field, the global peacebuilding field, and the domestic movement around bridge building that has emerged over the last several years to really share those lessons and cross-pollinate, which has been really great to see. The fourth area is around trusted elections. and representative and responsive governance. And just to pause here, I think we've talked about a couple of sort of levels at which we must address this. We certainly have an urgent crisis over the next 2 to 4 years around election integrity and around the sort of confidence, diminishing confidence that many Americans feel in the election process, that they can trust the election process. And that, I think, is a real risk, an urgent risk, deserves all of the attention that the Carter Center described that they're investing in this area. And so we at the partnership are highly focused on that. But I think also very important, as Stephen said in his remarks, we need to maintain that longer term vision. So even as we're working to address this urgent need and threat, we also need to sort of think about what do we need longer term to make sure that we can continue to renovate and improve our elections, our governance structures over time, and the continuing improvements that we need as we tend kind of our democracy. And then lastly, we need trusted, high quality, accessible news and information. So this is the positive agenda that we must strive for, but we can't do it, as you said, Thea, without policy responses and without government as an equal stakeholder in that process. We need policies such as those that were included in the legislation known as Build Back Better, for example. In that legislation, we had big initiatives like the Civilian Climate Corps, which would have facilitated the largest ever expansion of national service. Again, national service, a wonderful mechanism through which civic engagement really can be actualized. We also had in that legislation major support for rebuilding local news. Again, Stephen described the degradation of the local journalism market. Local journalism remains one of the most trusted sources of information across all segments of American society. It's also uniquely important as a sort of way to watch over government performance and hold government accountable at that local level. And then this legislation would have provided sort of tax incentives and credits that would have allowed increased ad revenues for local news media outlets and allowed them to then hire more journalists, et cetera. And so we're hopeful that through other kinds of breaking up some of these pieces that of the legislation of Build Back Better, that we'll still see the moving forward of these pieces of these democracy-related pieces of that agenda. But I'd say we also need other measures, such as the bipartisan Educating for American Democracy Act, introduced last year, which would invest $1 billion in expanding access to civics and history education in schools around the country. In recent decades, investments in civics education have declined, and we've really lost opportunities to prepare people for what self-government really means, to prepare them for what it means to be stewards of our civic culture. And we've seen I think we're now seeing the ramifications of that kind of de-investment in our civic education and our civic life and our civic culture. So we really need to make massive investments in that to kind of recoup those losses, including in the K-12 school system, which is what this legislation would address. But I think also, again, we need to look at that universal civic learning about how we address some of these deficits in our adult population. I think really quickly, I think the optimism for change is kind of bleak at the national level right now, but at the state and local level, there's also really important work being done, innovation being, experimented with, and success being had. And one recent example is the citizen-led redistricting effort in Michigan that just produced competitive districts for the first time there that will foster real political competition, that gives citizens a choice in the selection of their leaders. That was an entirely citizen-driven initiative and is going to dramatically transform governance, the sort of representation of Michiganders in that state. We have citizens cooperating on a bipartisan basis in 35 states through the iCivics Coalition to mobilize support for expanding access to civic education. So there is a lot that we can do to renew our democracy at the national level, at the local level, and making these investments is what's really going to build our resilience to the risks of political violence and other targeted violence that many of the other panelists have spoken about today.
Ashley, thank you so much. I mean, you've really given us a kind of a comprehensive sense of what the policy responses look like. One of the things that Liz often tells me is that, you know, in addition to all these great policies, we can't do it unless we fund it. And so we need our policymakers, and particularly you know, members of Congress, to fund these wonderful, great initiatives. I think we do have, you know, I want to thank our audience for hanging in with us. This has just been a fantastic conversation. As we are wrapping up, as we're kind of coming to the end of our time for the morning plenary, there are at least a couple of questions that I would like to throw out to our panelists, and perhaps just give us some quick responses. So one question is, how do we as peace builders begin to find common ground with extremists who are now more mainstream, where we get our news from different sources with different values and belief systems, where fear dominates and trust has broken down? And Michelle, I'm wondering if you can perhaps address that for us quickly. And then I'll just throw out one more question for our panelists to be thinking about, is factoring the insane amount of inequality in our society and the need to integrate innovation approaches in peace building. So how do we deal with economic inequality with all of these, you know, all of the issues that we've talked about today? And Stacia, perhaps you can address that, and Ashley jump in too if you're able to. So I'll let you all take it away. Michelle, if you're able to respond to that.
Sure. I mean, I'll try. I don't have a perfect answer. I think, you know, when we talk about building bridges, you think about it in the practical, physical sense. You don't immediately go from one side to the other. You build it out slowly with strong pillars and foundations and connections until you get to somewhere where we have some form of connective thread that unites us. I'm not sure that, I guess I would say that in the work that we do as peace builders, we have this inclination to lead with intergroup dialogue and cross-group work. When it comes to tending to these kinds of levels of identity threat, what I would suggest is a greater focus on affinity group work. So what it looks like to work within groups to meaningfully reduce levels of threat before you bring groups together across lines, which should open up the space or set you up to have more productive dialogue outcomes that are more sustainable in the long term. So I think it's about phasing and approaches. It's about key interlocutors with the resistant or harder to reach communities. When it comes to reducing threat and engaging those communities, are typically most responsive to in-group members and messengers with a high status. So there's a question there of where you start with the targeting and who brings who along. I know we're on the time crunch, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michelle. So Stacia.
Yes, and that leads right into the answer to my question, and really second what Michelle is saying, and certainly is what we are learning from the work that we're doing in the US. There's so much work that needs to be done in groups before you start that bridging work. And also it's about first going and starting the process of listening versus trying to convince someone that your side is correct. So so that is one thing we're really trying to focus on. But on this issue of inequality, I mean, part of it is it's a huge challenge. But I think, for example, the way that we're approaching it is the networks that we're building. Sure, we look across the political spectrum, but what we're trying to do is also making sure that it's ethnically diverse, socioeconomically diverse, that we're bridging rural and urban divides as well, and also institutional and non-institutional actors. So we're trying to build into these networks variety of contexts so that it's both individuals who tend to be excluded from the systems, as well as individuals who are inside the system, and building the conversations amongst them so that we can so that grievances, concerns can be raised, and potential solutions for action can be jointly problem solved together. So that is one of the ways, is first making sure that those excluded groups are getting a voice, but also helping them to be part of a broader system that can help to support them, and also finding actors within those systems who are willing to make change. If you look at the data on government, for example, accountability or political system accountability, it shows that the best approach, the most effective approach, is that you have people on the inside who want to make change. You find those key actors, and you connect them to the individuals on the outside who can help to create that public pressure on them and provide that public support for them to make that change. And that's one of the things we are trying to do through our efforts. The more diverse we can be, the more flexible and responsive as well those networks can be to whatever the issues are, whether it's at a community level or all the way up to the state level. And when we speak about identity-based conflict, we're actually talking, it can be political identity, ethnic, it can be economic identity, it can be a political position, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, for example. We're trying to make sure that we're building the skills to be reflexive to whatever the different types of conflicts that arise are faced for each of these individual communities, counties, and states.
Thank you, Stacia. Ashley, wondering if you had anything to add?
Stacia and Michelle were very comprehensive. I would just say the other I think opportunity is to again, this humanization of bringing people from diverse perspectives in contact with each other. We are so siloed, and that's across a lot, our geographies, our ideologies, but also in terms of our socioeconomic divisions. And one of the opportunities through, in service and in other kinds of people-to-people kinds of activities is the opportunity to sort of have that interaction between people of different levels of means. And I think that sort of humanizing of what the experience of socioeconomic kind of disadvantage looks like is part of how we get to kind of a more open mindset around the solutions to that. So that would be the only thing I would add.
Thank you very much, Ashley. And with that, I think I'd like to really thank our fantastic panelists. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for doing the work that you're doing to uphold and renew U.S. democracy. Just a couple of quick takeaways from me. The threat to our democracy is real, and it's going to take all of us across multiple sectors to address the problems. Our work needs to be grounded in research and data, and how we may be able to build bridges across these polarizing divides. And we need our policymakers to step up. We need the right kind of policy responses, the funding, and the infrastructure to really move forward. So thank you for all of you for joining us. I want to thank our audience for joining us this morning. I think I'm going to turn it over to Liz to wrap up the morning plenary for us.
Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Theo. I have to say, this is phenomenal. From the Melanie the U.S. Peacebuilding Award of Excellence to this whole session has been about the excellence that's here in the U.S. that gives me hope. And how do we build peace? Remember to use our hashtag, how do we build peace? It's all about being active. So thank you so much. It's a jam-packed day. We're grateful. Thank you.